Let's see, verse I want to begin. Joshua 24, let's begin in verse 15. Now, let's back up to verse 14. Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity. Joshua, just to give you the context, Joshua was an old man. Joshua took over leadership of Israel from Moses. Okay? Moses, because of sin in his life, was not allowed to enter the promised land. Joshua was the one who led the children of Israel out of the desert right here. They wandered in this area for 40 years, round and round and round in circles. Okay? Primarily, they wandered in this area. They were not allowed to go up to the land of Canaan. Okay? They weren't allowed to get there. So they wandered in this wilderness area for 40 years under the guidance of Moses. The reason they were not allowed to cross, and we'll get to that in a future study, the reason they weren't allowed to cross is because they didn't trust God. And they didn't trust the power of God to overcome their enemies when they did cross over. And so God says, okay, fine. You don't want to cross? You're not going to cross. And so he left them 40 years in the wilderness, wandering around until the generation that rejected him died. And then Moses was the last of that generation to die. And God led him up onto a mountain. He said, I want you to see the land. But because of your sin, you're not going to be allowed to cross the river into Canaan. And so Moses died there. And before he died, he told the people they were to follow Joshua. There were only 2 men who were counted in the book of Numbers. When Moses numbered the people, there were only 2 men who were numbered who got to go into Canaan. Joshua and Caleb. So, Joshua led the people into Canaan. They threw out the enemies. They conquered the cities. And now, in Joshua chapter 24, he's an old man. He is about to die. And he wants to set the children of Israel on a straight path. And he says this. He says in verse 14, now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt. So see, that leads me to understand, even though in Exodus, we don't read about them being engaged in idolatry. But that leads me to believe beyond the river would have been the molten calf that Aaron made. And in Egypt. So I think the Bible indicates they were engaged in idolatry in Egypt. He says, and serve the Lord. If it is evil to you in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve. Whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So that's a statement that leads me to this whole rabbit trail conclusion that the Israelites were engaged in idolatry and in sin while they were in Egypt. So anything else before we move into chapter 3? Okay, Dennis, we're back to you. Why don't you read chapter 3, verse 1 through 6. There's a paragraph break with verse 6. You're fine.
Okay. The burning bush. Now, Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared, and an flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see the great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called him, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come here. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God.
Okay, so if he's in the land of Midian and he went to the west side of the wilderness, he would probably be somewhere in this general region right in here. Where, I don't know exactly, possibly further over, but somewhere to the west side of Midian. Now, would you be afraid to look at God? I would be. You know why? I'm not good enough to look at God. Looking at God would be so intimidating because he would see right through. And he would know everything about me and everything that I ever did that wasn't right, wouldn't he? So I would kind of be a little bit scared. So Moses is scared, right? Is he scared, Emma? Okay. Yeah, so,
Well, God sees that anyway.
That's right.
I think if you were looking at God, you would see that he sees it.
Exactly.
Perception.
Exactly. It's easy to forget that God sees everything when you're not looking at God. Okay? So Moses sees this bush. But what's different about it? What is it, Emma?
It's burning, but it's not like burning. It just looks like it's on fire, but it's not like turning into ashes.
It's not turning black, right? And crumbling and falling down. Okay. I wanted to make sure I was right on that. So, what does Moses do, Vernon?
He turns aside.
And does what? And does what? Go ahead, River. What's Moses do? He turns aside and does what, River?
He said, God will hide.
Yeah, he goes over to look at the bush though first, doesn't he? Because he never saw anything like it. I mean, anything that's on fire burns up, right? Pretty much. And so Moses is like, what's going on? Goes over to check it out. And Dennis, what's it say about his shoes?
He didn't take them off. He said, take off your shoes.
Okay.
You're on holy ground.
Okay. Does anybody understand that? I used to argue with my dad. I love to kick my shoes off under the church pew. Put your shoes back on. He'd give me a swift kick. He'd say, you're not allowed to have it. I'm like, look, Moses was told to take his shoes off on holy ground. That was my argument. And that was just because I was being a smart kid.
Abigail takes her shoes off.
All the time. We used to go down to Belleville, West Virginia quite a bit. Those folks down there said I lived on the wrong side of the Ohio River because my kids were always shoeless. They said, there was an old fellow down there, he's like, they grow up just the way I grew up when I was a kid. So, anyway, but why? Any ideas? Why did God require that? It says it's holy ground, okay, but why?
He didn't want to sin on it. He didn't want to, I think he was trying to say, take your shoes off, I don't want you to, this land is almost like sacred, I don't want you to sit on it,
Okay, all right.
so I wanna leave it pure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we don't have as much of a custom here in the United States. I mean, you come into my house, you might as well leave your shoes on because it's plenty dirty. But particularly, we had some neighbors that were in military service. They spent a lot of time in Japan after World War II. And it was customary, and in fact, I believe maybe it was a daughter or something. I don't remember. But it was customary in Japan. You enter the house and the host comes and removes your shoes. And so this couple's daughter, when they came back from the United States, the first person who came in, she greeted them at the door, "May I take your shoes?" And her mother remembered that, it was like, really? We didn't explain to her the difference in culture, but it was a sign of respect to leave your dirty shoes at the door. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think this is God's way of, you respect where I'm at. Leave your dirty shoes at the door, or and so I don't know. That's my take on it. I may be dead wrong on that, but I think that's, like I said, our culture's not the same. But when Jesus put the towel around his waist at the Last Supper and washed their feet, it was a sign of servitude, and that was typically what one did when somebody entered a house. They would remove their sandals, and the host would, or a servant of the host, I guess I should say, would wash their feet. And so I think this is just showing respect for God. So what does God say about himself? How's God introduce himself in this passage? He says, "I am the God of." Okay. And who are his fathers? Does he say? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why do you think he needed to introduce himself to Moses?
Because Moses probably have been away from God for a very.
Maybe so, but he's also letting him know that, hey, this is just not a bush that's on fire. This is the fire is actually representing something else. See, God never allows anyone in the Bible to see him or his face. Now, Moses was allowed a glimpse of, quote, God's hind parts, his back. But that's as close as God allowed anyone to ever see his glory. And even after Moses had gone up on Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments, years later from this, what happened, Cynthia? His face.
He was so quiet that when he came back off the mountain, everybody was like,
It was a radiant white, like a super bright light bulb. His face lit up, so much so that the Israelites said, "That's right, Emma. Put a veil over your face because we can't stand the brightness of it." Okay. So God is represented here, but he's not seen. And he introduces himself so that Moses knows what's going on. Let's move into the next paragraph. I think we've got time maybe to get the next paragraph. Wendell, I'm going to break this paragraph. It's a long one. If you can read 7 and 8. And then I'm going to go to Greg, and if you could read, Greg, when Wendell's done, 9 through 12. And then we'll discuss that paragraph. 7 and 8.
tribute ram, and a large material, going with milk and honey to the place of the leaves, and the kite and the snakes and whatever. Usually.
Okay, Greg, you want to pick up in verse 9?
Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain.
Okay, so we're gonna have to look a little bit into the future to see what happens. But what's God basically telling Moses here? I think there's a song, I don't think it's in our books, but there is a song, to the effect of, I've heard my people cry. That song is based on this statement that God has heard his people cry. And he's heard their plea. He's listening. What's his game plan?
So Moses back to go get them.
That's right.
It's like kind of a punishment thing now, when I read. He picked his punishment, but.
Moses picked his
Like
punishment.
David got to pick his punishment.
So remember, Moses left Egypt because he was afraid of Pharaoh.
Yeah.
But that Pharaoh is dead. So chances are the other Pharaoh is not going to remember him. But I want you to think about something else. Moses. Yeah. So Moses has a wife. He has a family now. Moses is somewhere around the age of 40, give or take a little bit. And so he's listening to God. What would your reaction be? If you were happily married, settled in, you have a family, you're where you want to be in life. You've worked your whole life to get to this point. And suddenly, God says, go back to Egypt. Go back where the slavery's at.
So I felt like he was being punished.
Well, let's just say Moses is going to be a very reluctant hero. A very reluctant hero. There are a lot of reluctant heroes in the Bible. Cynthia, you have a thought. I can see it.
To me, it's like God has come to him and said, Moses, I've got a job for you to do. And Moses steps back and he's like, wait,
Well, we haven't even got to that good part yet.
I'm not sure if I'm going to go back to Egypt. And two, he's got to be thinking of the man that he killed, the reaction of the Israelites.
Exactly. You gonna kill me too?
And if he's probably not outlived any of them, they're probably still alive. And when he would go back, who's to say what they're gonna do? And the new Pharaoh, I know, Moses, he's an Israelite. He might know the Egyptian ways and raised there, but he still is an Israelite. And so to go before Pharaoh and do, God saying, you're going to be the leader.
The other thing to consider, chances are, Moses was raised by Pharaoh's daughter. So chances are, he knows the new Pharaoh. It's probably a brother of the woman who raised him. So he probably knows this guy, probably pretty well, which again, familiarity might breed contempt, as my old boss used to say, or it might breed fear. And as we talked last week, these Egyptians in their royal families were not nice people. Brothers and sisters tried to kill each other so that they could be the one in line for the throne. Sometimes they married one another so that they didn't allow the royal family to branch out. Just horrible people. And so Moses is probably, I would be like, no way, Lord. They want to get away? Let them do what I did. But I want to go ahead, we're up against the clock, but I want to go ahead and just give you a little bit, and we'll probably study this a little bit more next week. But I want to give you a little bit of Moses' reaction. Verse 13. Then Moses said, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. Oh, what a perfect answer for that. I can just imagine, Moses being like, oh yeah, that's going to work. Okay? So, and he said, say to the people of Israel, I am has sent me. God said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me. This is my name forever. Thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you, and what has been done to you in Egypt. And I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey, and they will listen to your voice. And the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. And now, please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand, and I will strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go. And I will give his people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty, but each woman shall ask of her neighbor, and any woman who lives in her house, for silver and gold and jewelry, and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. But then we'll get into Moses' response next week, but that's the basis. There's a few points I want to draw out in that paragraph, but I wanted to read it so that it's in our minds and we can be thinking about what God said. But particularly, I want you to notice what God says and think about this week. He says, let's see, I've misplaced it already. Verse 19. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go. I want you to think on that, because there's a passage in here where it says God hardened the heart of Pharaoh. We're going to discuss that in a couple of chapters down. But I want you to think about what God says. Pharaoh will not let you go. Any final thoughts, comments, questions before we wrap up our study tonight? Anybody? All right.
Other than Tom? Other
Yes.
than- Because you asked me a question quick, I forgot what song number we're on.
We'll get that. Yep.